Welcome to the Heal, Thrive, Dream podcast, where trauma survivors become healthy thrivers. Each month, we'll feature a theme in the trauma recovery and empowerment field. To promote your recovery, healing, and learning how to build dreams, here's your host, Karen Robinson, transformational coach and therapist.
Hi, everyone. Welcome back to the Heal, Thrive, Dream podcast. Today, our special guest is Reverend Leslie Peters. Reverend Leslie is an inspirational speaker, a spiritual teacher, a guide, and mentor. Before this new change, she was a public health nurse for over 30 years. And I really hope she shares some of those stories with us today, too. So, Reverend Leslie, thank you for being here today.
Well, thank you, Karen, for having us. How are you on this fabulous day?
I'm doing well. Thank you so much. What about yourself?
Good. Let me first say thank you so much for the work you do and, for being an advocate for people who've struggled and been trauma and, adversity. And thank you for being there for them.
Likewise. I was excited to hear when we were talking before recording that you did some public health nursing. It's such a huge need. So yeah, I hope you're willing. Yeah, go ahead.
To talk. Yeah, I was going to say, it's funny that that position came about. I kind of followed my intuition my whole life and just kind of felt my way through life, right? And if it felt right, I went with it. If it didn't feel right, I didn't go with it. And so I did work in the hospital for a while, and I worked in labor and delivery, and one day we went to work and the doors were closed. I'm like, oh, okay. Oh. They had talked about closing the unit, but no one actually set a date. Like, we still had supper and lockers. But anyhow, I was coming home that day, and my neighbor was a CFO for a home care company. And he said, well, listen, he said, the areas aren't that great. And but if you want a job, I'm like, yeah, sure, I'll try it. Ended up I loved it. It was the greatest job ever, short of wearing black scrubs, so I couldn't see bugs crawling on me. Besides that, it was an amazing. It took me about 3 or 4 months to learn that. I kept throwing away my white scrubs because I'm like, I can't even clean these. So, But the women I met were just incredible. I mean, they were, when you do public health and you go into the streets and into the homes, you get a whole different view of the problems and the solutions that they tell you they need, right? Mm-hmm. I would sit in meetings with different nonprofits and they would talk about nutrition and cooking meals. I'm like, but you don't understand. There really aren't even any kitchens in these places that you can cook in, because a lot of them were rented and they were just not a place you wouldn't cook, And I'm like, so you want to get some stuff in there, get some reasonable, food trucks, with healthy food, because I got it. If you've ever been in I worked in one of the poorest zip codes in Philly, and besides fast food, there wasn't much healthy, so you go to a corner store, you have a few kids, you're going to get the cheapest food there is. And, that kind of stuff, I think you can only learn by being in the trenches. And yeah. And you just saw a whole different side, the stereotypes, the judgments people have. At least the women I worked with over the years, very few were true. And I used to ask my friends, because I was middle class, I'm like, how many of my patients you think do drugs? What percent? They're like, 80. And I'm like, no, not even 1%. I had very few over the years. Yeah. So just certain things like that, I really felt like I became a voice because, to be honest with you, from the outside, from the streets, from the homes we lived in, our lives looked much different, but our stories were pretty damn similar on where we started, with trauma and adversity. And that's what I found throughout my life. I started talking to strangers at the age of 16 to deal with my own trauma and asking questions. And what I saw is that, no matter where you go, the stuff that keeps us stuck or the stuff that causes us to be at unrest within is not much different between any of us.
That's right.
Oh,
Yeah. We have more similarities than differences for sure. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And so public health was, it was just, do you want to ask me specific questions or else want to experiment?
Yeah, I do. I'm very curious and only share what you're comfortable with, but you mentioned your own trauma. And as you know, the women listen to my podcast are trauma survivors. So what about your own personal story do you feel comfortable with sharing with them for the connection piece?
Yeah, my story was I didn't remember much of it. Luckily, I blocked it out. And when I remembered from the age of 12 on. And so back when I left work around 2017, I did so just because I was called, right? For 2 years, I kept hearing your job here is done. And I'm like, I love my job. I'm not leaving, and I kind of ignored the call for 2 years. But when I left work and that Drexel University said to me, like, what are you doing with your patients? They have much better life outcome. I kind of thought, I'm like, I don't know, nothing real. Like, I'm not doing anything in particular, but that got me onto a path of really looking at my own past. And what did I do? How did I, alone in the world with no emotional support, end up emotionally healing without even knowing I needed healing? And my trauma, I was able to turn it to love. So when I went back and looked, I realized that from the ages of 2 to 12, I really didn't remember much. There was one experience or two with my dad where I made him mad, but I started a process of writing to my younger self. And this was a couple years ago. And I started that because I wake up every morning and I can't remember who I am. I wake up in a panic and go, who am I? Like, what am I doing? Like, I know the demographics, but I can't remember my passions, my likes, my dislikes. And I figured it was trauma that caused that. And so I started writing, and I can't remember the guy who did it. It was evidence-based, but with your dominant hand, you ask yourself a question from the adult self, and then you allow the left hand to answer. Now, you allow the non-dominant. I don't write left-handed, but you can kind of tell. Now, being a curious but science person, I was trying to prove it wrong by telling my left hand. So I wrote, like, why do we wake up in the morning like this? And I was telling my left hand to write something, and it started writing something different. And it started writing, we hate her. And I'm like, ooh, okay, this might be a clue. So I started writing from the adult self, going, who do we hate? And son of a gun, it didn't start writing my name. And I'm going, uh-oh, I got work to do. Like, what do you mean I hate myself? Long story short, that went into a year and a half of automatic writing, they call it. Like, I must have self-hypnosed because I would write, and I don't even remember writing. And a lot of the traumas came out in child's handwriting, which was really cool. But in that, what I uncovered is that when I went out in the world at age 16, because I felt like I needed to be connected, I needed connection, that person out in the world who was vulnerable and just opened her heart, risking to be hurt again, that person thrived and healed. But every time I'd go back home, I'd dim myself a little bit because I didn't feel like being verbally accosted for being too much, right? And the armor I wore at home, hiding myself, that's who I hated. It was like, because I abandoned myself by wearing the armor and the mask, and that's when I realized, my God, so many of us walk around and we just just feel this conflict within, and we feel angry. Like, people told me throughout the years they would feel angry and unsupported and frustrated. And I never understood why. I manifest really well because past couple of years stuff's happened that now I totally understand why. But, it's just, I think a lot of that is we're not being who we know we are. And so a lot of that anger and frustration is really at ourselves.
Yes.
What do you feel like that being? I mean, you've seen patients. Does that kind of ring true with what you've seen?
100%. And even the piece where you were mentioning your memory, not remembering much before 12. That's very, very common. I mean, it's different ages for people. We usually get stuck developmentally when our traumas happened. And sometimes when we look back, there's no other way but to look back as the child self. So it's very hard to make sense of when that happens.
Well, I mean, it goes, we could do shows and shows on what I uncovered, but you had asked about specific trauma. And I think what started it all, and I did take myself back and remember when I was 2, I remember in the middle of a diaper change, my dad went to kiss me. And I remember thinking, and I'm actually writing as a child, you just ruined everything. What did you do? Because it wasn't the kind of kiss a parent should kiss. And then I believe there was a lot of not intercourse, but it was oral sex giving him. I think that was my childhood from like 2 to 12. And I did, one of the things that I really had to be kind with myself about is during those writings, I uncovered that I told my mom. She did nothing. I told an aunt who told me, and when this came out, I was like, oh my God, I had this aunt who was really whiny, and no one really triggers me, but she did, because she'd always say, you're strong. I'm not as strong as you. And it really just irked me. Well, in the writing to myself, when I told my aunt, she told me that my father was a good man and I was strong. I could deal with it. And I went, no wonder she triggers me. But then I told her. No wonder. I actually started to cry when I found that out. I'm like, because I always felt so bad being nasty. Like nobody ever triggered me, right? Like I could pretty much hold anybody and be okay with it, because as long as my heart was open, I wasn't wearing the armor. But, I also found out, like I told a kindergarten teacher, first grade teacher, second grade teacher, and nobody did anything. It was the 60s, I just thought, well, don't be dramatic, whatever. But so that was, and I think I told my father, I stopped at age 12, and that's when the verbal abuse, the gaslighting and all that started, which, for me, not for anyone else, but for me, I think that caused more damage than any physical. Because what I learned was that at a very young age, I remember now going it's not about me. I wonder why he's hurting. What's wrong? I call them the heart healings. What I use, it was these dozen or so things that I used that I could walk. I never had a belief that it was about me. I did have a belief I was too much and I was alone, but years later I would find out I had TBI at age 2. And so I imagine I was too much, my cognitive thing for people who didn't know about, learning challenges. So, but I was able to shift the perception. So I didn't have to worry about changing the belief. Make sense?
Absolutely.
How I did that. I mean, that's why it gets by how I did that in this very long story, but in the writing, I can say this. 2018, I started using a computer a lot for the first time. I never used one in nursing except for the text. And I was having a lot of issues with the computer, neurological issues. And being about the ACEs study, I went, wow, maybe my brain got, because I couldn't figure out what it was. Went and had a bunch, 4 or 5 neuropsych exams and evaluations. And there was significant brain damage, traumatic brain injury. Probably started from a car accident at age 2. And then I imagine just everything on top of it. But the amnesia, whatever they're saying, is because there were too many alpha waves in the occipital area. So when I wake up, it takes a while for my brain to wake up. But all this stuff happened and I'm like, oh my God, it all makes sense. I think I had a near-death experience at age 2. Because I took myself back to writing, and in real life time, I didn't see the light or anything, but I saw myself in the ER crying, saying, don't send me home. And then all of a sudden I felt this incredible warmth and this voiceless voice that I've heard all my life. I thought it was my intuition had said,
and God.
And said, you have to go home. Your life's going to be really difficult, but you will be safe. And what I'm doing for you, you will do for others. And I went, oh my God, people always told me my whole life I create a safe space and I allow them to feel safe. And I'm like, That's so, but yeah, and even the synchronicities, the way I found out about the near-death experiences, I did a talk, and months later, I felt like I had to go back to that group for some reason. So I canceled a business appointment, go back to the group. Some woman says, "Hey, did you ever read Forever Angels?" I said, "No." Downloaded the book, listened, and went, "Oh, wow." So like the it's been so cool. Mm-hmm. But I was, and this is going to sound horrible, it's not, but if we can learn to shift the perception of what we experience, that's why I want to teach kids, like this curriculum I put together, is let's nip it in the bud instead of dealing with trauma. Because I believe all these heart healings I was guided. I was 2 and 3 years old using visioning and affirmations. Come on, that's not me. I really like that, you know what I
mean? Yeah, that's something I haven't heard. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, so one of the first, I'll just tell the first couple, it's what I did, and I still do today. Because when I wake up like that, it's scary, right? And so I kind of reconnect with myself every day. But I would put my hand on my heart. And I would do something called rubber band breathing. And I would imagine that there was a rubber band going from my toes to my head. And I would breathe all the way up, holding my belly in, and then breathe all the way back down, still holding my belly in. Now, decades later, when I went to get trained to do Reiki, I was showing the woman how I breathe. She goes, "Where'd you learn that?" I'm like, "I've been doing that since I was a kid. I call it rubber band breathing." She said, "That's what Reiki masters do." And I'm like, so it's, you know what I mean? It had to be, I ended up having like 3 near-death experiences I didn't remember. One at 18, one at 42 also. And yeah, it was trauma. And the research I was doing on it, the trauma brain is really like a precursor to spiritual enlightenment.
Ooh.
Yeah. I'll have to tell you. I don't
want
to. So, and tell me if this is not along the lines you wanted to go. But I like people to see that those of us who had trauma, and this is going to sound crazy, but we're the ones who are truly compassionate and empathetic.
That's right.
You know what I mean? And we only get into trouble when we put the armor on, because then we hide ourselves with our pain, right? When you open your heart and risk to open and being hurt again, that pain can it goes. You release it, and we release ourselves with that pain. And, that's what I said, out in the world when I was 16, the way I dealt, I never quite fit in with anyone. I was kind of a philosopher at a young age. And I tried to fit in high school. So I put the armor on, pretend to be like other people. And that was horrible, because not only did I not feel connected to anyone else, but then I felt disconnected from me. So at 16, I went, I either need to change something or I got to end it, because I don't want to live this way. And I didn't know how to feel connected or feel seen. But I went out, when I got my license, I just started driving around looking at people going, how are they like me? What are their lives like? How are their lives like mine? And that allowed me to feel less alone within a couple of months. But then I was really curious. I would stop people on the streets and go, "Hey, my name's Leslie. And I kind of struggle with this. I was wondering about you." And I mean, I did that my entire life.
Wow.
And nobody ever said, and then I would hug, right? Like because I always looked in their eyes, which I find out is a visual processing thing from the brain, right? Like there's a gift in every part of my traumatic brain injury. There's a gift in every part. And, but what I ended up doing for my entire life is at least, I'd say 15 to 20 people a day, these quick 10-minute, deep, intimate connections, followed by a hug. And I'm going, that's science. It's heart brain coherence, the hugging, oxytocin, right? Like it's so cool because it all made sense. And the only thing I did was listen to my intuition, or that voice, whether it was my intuition, my soul, God, I'm not sure, my guides. But I didn't have any knowledge when I did all this stuff. It was just following my intuition. And so that's how I lived my life. And in that state of, I call living life with on heart, listening to my intuition, everything just fell into place. I'd be like, oh, I want to go to nursing school. And before I knew it, boom, I was in school. People are like, how many years were you on the list? How many nights did you sleep out? I'm like, what are you talking about? I filled out an application, took a test, and it was in. So, my message to everyone is like, we so undervalue self-connection because it's scary. And I know the other side of the road now, because the past few years in learning with my challenges, I have felt separate from the world. I'm noticing the differences, right? Like before, I still feel one with the world, but I don't feel like the world feels one with me. That's a better way of saying it, I think. But when there's oneness, pain can turn into love, and the only way to feel one with others, though, is to take the armor off. I never saw the scary side of taking the armor off before because I was always surrounded by people in trauma, right? And people in trauma are really good at figuring out who's authentic or not. So I think my authenticity was valued. Now that I've been dealing on the other end of healthcare with management, I'm seeing I still have to be vulnerable and authentic, but it's a tad bit more difficult. I don't know. Have you experienced that as a social worker?
Yeah, absolutely. So I want to do a little bit of a recap because there have so many gold nuggets, And also to tell you too, for our YouTube watchers, sometimes your camera is a little shaky. So I think you're hitting the table. Just FYI.
I'll move. Thank you. I'll move my arms.
Because you don't want to give, I'm always conscious of that because I don't want to give people whiplash when they're watching.
Yeah.
Okay, so these are the gold nuggets I've gotten so far. And I got to look up that researcher you were talking about. So the things that have been really helpful in your healing journey, one is writing. Writing the question from the adult perspective with one hand, and then the research is with the other hand, the child story can come out even though you didn't exactly use it that way, right? Yes. That's the technique. Another technique you use is the eye-to-eye connection with people, hearing their stories, and then the hug, that is the oxytocin, the feel-good hormones. Another thing you mentioned is a lot of affirmations, I statements during your healing journey.
Yeah.
And you also mentioned the ACE study, and I want to tell people who don't know what that is. It's adverse childhood events. And it sounds like, Reverend Leslie, you had many, many events. And
it is the average childhood experience study, and it actually was done in the late 90s by CDC and Kaiser. And basically what it did in a nutshell was it proved there was a science behind the impact the stories have not only on our behavior, our cognition, our dental health, our emotional well-being, our mental health, physical and social risk factors like drugs and suicide and teen pregnancy. And there was a definitive link. And now the studies don't say this, but from my own professional and personal experience, I consider trauma anything that leaves a person feeling emotionally or physically unsafe, real or perceived, right? On a regular basis. And so what that means is, let's take the perceived. Let's say that no one ever hit me, but one of my parents comes home and they're drunk all the time, and I'm scared that something's going to happen. That fear every day is as good enough. I mean, it's not as good enough, but it still causes the body to go into that fight, flight, freeze, which that state of chronic stress, our bodies are rolling around in this high stress state, and it's causing inflammation. So, I think one of the challenging things with physical health now, particularly like I'm 60, if you're in your 40s, 50s, a lot of our health developed when it can even go back to in utero, right? Like my son's issues, physical, that are related to trauma, he has the same ones I do, and he's never experienced quote unquote trauma. But I was under a lot of emotional stress when I was pregnant, and it changed his, so it's kind of crazy.
Yes, it is.
And I think
crazy.
Yeah, but at the end of the day, I think what we all, trauma or not, really need to learn to do is feel safe with ourselves. Because when I felt safe with myself, out in the world. I felt safe anywhere with anyone because my intuition would always go, go away, you know. And if you got the armor on, you can't see yourself. So you can't exactly feel safe with yourself, you know, or trust your intuition if you can't even see, you know. And so that's really what I came out to teach people to do, is to reconnect with themselves so they can feel safe with themselves, you know. And
yeah, maybe finish telling us about the heart program that you teach. Tell us what each letter means again, and go over that.
Yeah, heart, it came about by a business coach said, teach people what you do. And I went, all right, tell me what I do. What are you talking about? And that's a hard thing. Like I realized now that I was asleep to the fact I was spiritually awake out in the world. I just, it was this utopia I saw. Like the world was my home, strangers were my family. I never felt alone, ever, even though I emotionally was my whole life, you know? And so heart, when he said, teach people how to walk towards people most of us walk away from. What makes you walk towards them?
Wow.
And so, you know, it took me a couple months, but I came up with honesty, empathy, acceptance, respect, and trust. Now, that first year or so, I thought it was just giving those characteristics to others. But then when I uncovered the armor, I went, oh, no. Once you're honest, empathetic, accepting, respecting, and trusting of yourself, you don't have to try. Like I've never tried to be kind to anybody. It kind of just
happens.
It's a state of being, which is why I didn't know what value I provided to the women. And in reality, the foundation of what I did was the willingness to sit in the vulnerability of my own being, which allowed them a safe space to experience the freedom of theirs. And then once they saw themselves, they started seeing everything clearer, you know, and by being open about experiences and just, I always taught through conversation. Like, I don't like to tell people things. I like them to kind of figure it out on their own. So I ask questions.
More effective. Way more effective. Yep.
Yeah. None of us like to be taught, you know, especially our trauma. It's like that, like, don't tell me not to do this. Here you're done.
Yeah. Not liking authority is huge for trauma survivors. It's like, we already felt powerless, whether we remember it or not, many times in our childhood. We want to have our own power.
It's huge. And it's real. And you know what? I mean, a lot of it, to be honest with you. So I like to empower. So the acronym, that heart stands for, and then what came from that is, because everyone kept saying, what's your program? I'm like, I am my program. Or what's your message? What are you selling? And I'm like, I'm selling the message that I was given as a kid, this one about how the world that can be and the us that we are. I mean, up until the past few years, like everyone I saw the love. And if we see someone else's light, it serves as a mirror for them to see their light. It really is that simple. But you gotta see your own light first. That's the hard part. The hard part is seeing your own light, you know? And if the armor's on, forget it. You can't. That's where I've had problems now, is I've always worked with people that my authenticity created a safe space for them. And that's where the magic happens, when two people are open. I haven't mastered yet with the people we're talking about, like, you know, wearing the armor pretty heavy. I haven't broken through to a lot of them yet. So I don't have the answer to that yet. But it is, everything starts with us. And, you know, so from that, I came up with the principles. So the philosophy heart is to ace connection. And they're all acronyms. It's too long, but they're really important ones. Like to live with love is how I did. And that was, you know, if we can start looking to inspire, validate, elevate people through listening with objectivity, vulnerability, to empower them. Like that's how I was guided to live my life. So like everyone, I always want to empower people, you know, and now that I'm seeing our society from a different viewpoint, I see how it's not always like that, is it? That other people want to empower other one, you know?
Yeah.
So, you know, I mean, So what I'm doing now, truly, I'm an advocate for anyone who doesn't feel seen or heard, because I never did. And the only way I knew how to get my needs met were to give what I needed to others. And that worked quite well. And if I'd had the armor on all the time, it probably wouldn't have been a healthy coping mechanism. But with the armor off, it was totally healthy because I didn't want to control. I didn't need anything back. That exchange of energy, when I gave, I got the energy back, and it just kind of like, incoherence of science. So for people, what I do now is I do these conversations, and I don't charge for them because they're found in unconditional love and acceptance. So if I charge, there's a condition. I do accept donations, but they usually take a couple hours, and I just ask people open-ended questions. And it's not even, they're not direct. It's kind of like, talk to me about love. Talk to me about trust. So I would do these with former patients and their friends. And out of the the aha moments they had during these, it was amazing. And the more they understood themselves, the taller they sat. And throughout the conversation, they're like, I can't believe you're just doing this. No one's paying you. I'm like, no, I just want to know about you. And that in itself, that somebody was going to take the time, they were important enough for someone to learn about, that is so underrated. And I get systems, people, we don't have time to do that. But what we don't understand is if we take time to do that for others, we're learning about ourselves. The way I learned about myself is through asking and listening to other people. Because I'd go, ooh, I do that, But in those conversations, within 6 months, 30% of the women, one pulled them off welfare, the other one wrote a book, the other one stopped drinking, the other one started keeping a daily diary of how she spoke to her kids. And they all attributed it to the conversation, nothing else. Feeling seen for the first time ever, feeling safe and accepted to be seen, wanting to know more about who they were. And the third was, in that 2-3 hour conversation, they shifted their self-perception. I'm like, seriously, how many years do we? So, that's what I do. If anyone wants, I will share it. I think I did Calendly link, just schedule one. And because those are the people, particularly now that with my traumatic brain injury and stuff, I'm finding it really hard. I'm seeing how I think neurodiversity is a lot of the issues that happen with people who struggle in life. I think there's probably a lot of undiagnosed neurodiversity that we just don't know how to work the way the rest of the world works. And
I agree with that. Yeah.
Yeah. I'm seeing it's like trauma people aren't the problem. If people are authentic and they know they're struggling and they ask for help, how is that ever a problem? The problem is those who judge them for having the problem, so.
Agreed.
Yeah. So I'm an advocate for anyone who needs to be seen, feel loved, feel accepted, because I've been there. And I don't judge anyone because God, in my life, who am I to judge?
Right. I usually tell my clients, once I get myself completely together, like in complete perfection, then I'll start judging. And since that's not going to happen.
I'll tell you what, it was hard. The past 4 or 5 years have been really challenging for me because when I was diagnosed, you name it. I was like, whoa, I'm like amazed that I did everything I did. And that was because I was in a state of flow. And I know I did everything I did because I felt one with the world and I didn't feel alone. That's why I survived and thrived. I went to college twice, finished top of my class in nursing. My reading comprehension is so poor that I see now I don't read more than 2 sentences and I'm lost. I'm like, how did I get through college? I listened. That's how I got so good at listening, right? There's the gift.
Wow.
But I had a really hard time because I was like, I had foreigner psychiatrists are like, you're never going to be productive in this world. They're like, I don't even know how you got through life like this. And I'm like, bull. There was that, authority. You tell me I can't. Thank you. Now I'm going to fight like hell to do it.
Yeah.
That was always my thing, right? Like, you think I can't do it? Watch me. I'll do it.
Watch me.
But I tried and tried and tried. I worked 16 hours a day, and it was not only was I doing it for me, but I remembered the voices of so many of the women who would say to me, I don't know why, but I can't seem to do the same things people do the same way they do it. And I was like, wow, I can figure out how to work with mine. But I never did. I just got really sick. And here's the cool thing too, all the diagnoses that come with trauma. I mean, my diagnoses were like a walking case study, right? Autoimmune, like all. They had pretty much stayed dormant with the exception of migraines through my life, occasional flare up. But about a year or so after stopping working and caring and being in coherence with the world and loving people, everything came to the surface. So in 1 year, I think I had general anxiety, major depression, complex PTSD. My central nervous system was fried. My endocrine system went haywire. And I didn't do therapy because I had therapists say, like, you have too much stuff going on. And I'm like,
no.
So
what
on
a
the
message.
road, yeah. But you know what? I got to see how disempowering the systems are.
Yes.
From all the years of childhood and then even marrying someone like my father, I was never physically abused, but the emotional abuse continued my whole life. I just learned how to go, it's not me, it's still, I know. But with that, all of that adversity, I've never felt so disempowered as 2 years of going through disability, the social service system, the health, mental health, the most disempowering experiences of my life. So I think I was given them for a reason, when the curriculum, because what I really wanted to do is change systems. And I thought that would be much easier than it has been. But, it's just if I can tell people anything, the I am safe is really good, because what it does too is when I would do I am safe, I could connect with the beat of my heart.
Mm-hmm.
And it was so every morning, some mornings I can't, there's some morning, I'm not telling you like, oh, this works perfect all the time. It's not easy. I mean, I look back and everything, the way I live my life, to be that, to shift perception and see everything as a gift. It's a lot of work initially, but then it just happens automatically. One of the things, though, is really important before we shift perception. I did this for my patients, but I did not do this for myself. You have to validate the negative experience, right? Mm-hmm. So I would say, like, something bad would happen. I'd be, okay, great. Well, thank you for this. And I'd always say thank you to whatever. But I never went, oh, God, that feels really bad in my body.
And you deserve better.
Right. So I think if I had acknowledged all the negativity, that I was able to shift perception, if I was able to acknowledge it, I don't think the body would have not stored all the trauma, but I'm saying, like,
pretty much.
I think, yeah, but I think what saved me was that rubber band breathing. I think it kept things moving, so it didn't get really trapped, that it was symptomatic. So I know I've given you a lot of stuff. It's so hard because so much has happened that I try to think, what are the really important things? But the very basic, very easy. I'm working on a book now, and it's going to be coming out. I think once it's out, I'm going to put the heart healings out. And just because, people are like, oh, don't you value yourself, charge money? I'm like, no, I do value myself. And once I get my head to figure out how to make money, I just go down a rabbit hole. I know from my whole life that if I'm aligned with what I'm doing, money comes.
Money comes. Yeah, I agree with that too. Yeah, when your book comes out, let us know so I can put the Amazon link in the show notes, because people are going to want to read it.
Yeah, well, and this first book, I got to be honest with you, I had Hashimoto's encephalopathy too, with all those all in about 2 years when I was on the road traveling, because I listened to my intuition, like a year before that said, go. And I'm like, where am I going? But I picked up and left. So all those things hit when I was on the road without a home. And so I'm just now trying to figure out how to organize. So this first book is going to be not a whole lot. It's going to be all the nuggets, but not a lot of fluff, if that makes sense.
That sounds terrible. No fluff?
No,
but people want the nuggets. People want the nuggets.
But because I can't figure out how to organize, because the way my life worked, like I didn't focus on time. I know there was no time ever. So sequencing everything, I'm like, oh God, I don't even remember like how, but I want to give the important pieces in this book. And, it was actually funny. It's going to be a full book, but I hired a ghostwriter a couple of years ago to write this book. And you want to talk about self-trust and lack of it. Every bad decision I've ever made is because I didn't follow my intuition, right? I doubted myself. I made it when I was in a state of like panic, desperation. Never make a decision in those modes, right? But this thing, I paid someone $15,000, a company, to do it. They came back with the thing, and I'm like, oh God, this isn't even close. It was nothing what I told the ghostwriter in all our calls, and they wouldn't change it. And I thought, I need to get my power. So I'm not losing my power over this. So I'm putting stuff to put in front of the book. And I think that might be really cool because readers will get to see, I think I put it like in the book I wanted to write, and I share like little blurbs about each thing, pages and pages. And then you'll get to know the heart healings and what I did. But then you'll read the book they wrote. So it'll just kind of, a lot of this I like to give people.
That's a really interesting way to do that. And I think there's probably a lot of value in that, because it's also showing, as survivors, we do tend to struggle with decision making and making a poor decision, and how you are self-correcting it. I think that benefits you and
it is,
and everyone that reads it.
Yeah, I figured, like whatever. And that was a lot of the shift turnaround. Like if people were angry and yelling, I don't walk away. I just like find in myself to love them even more. But everything I do in my life, I've always known my power. And as long as I can see myself, and as long as I'm connected with me and I'm not hiding, then no one can ever take my power. So I can loan it, knowing I don't lose it, and someone's like, what do you mean you can loan it? I'm like, okay, if I get stopped by a cop for speeding, right? I'm not going to mouth off or do whatever. I'm going to say, thank you so much. I'm going to give him my power for a little bit, because at the end of the day, in that moment, my hands is in it. It's in my life. You know what I mean? But it's even if somebody's really scared and they need to feel empowered, okay, borrow my power a little bit, because it's not going anywhere. It's mine, but I'll just let you feel like, does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
But you can't do that in the moments in the past couple of years where I've been really sick. I wasn't so good at doing that. So I see now how chronic health really chronic health issues throws into a cycle, because when you're not feeling well, your energy is low. You're not communicating with that energy that creates flow and whatever. So people aren't responding the same way, because it is this cycle, So I'm glad everything happened the past few years, because it's really shown me it was like going into public health, right? Like I've always thought myself, I'd do a guinea pig. I jump into a hole. I always did when I was younger. Let me see what that's like. And I jump in and see how I can find my way out. This has been a big hole, really big. But once I get totally out of it, I think there's so much I've learned that I am so much more empathy on an experience level for people who are struggling. Because at the end of the day, I want to change systems, but I know who my peeps are. My tribe, it's people. Yeah. It's people who don't feel seen or heard, and that's who I want to be an advocate for. So,
well, the thing is, that's kind of a lot of people. So I'm glad that I'm glad that you're writing and speaking, because that's a way to reach more people, and being on podcasts and things like that.
Yeah.
So
out of time.
we're getting there. So I wanted you to maybe think about if there's someone out there right now that's listening that really does feel unseen, unheard, and other than the ability to schedule with you, do you have any other words of inspiration or hope that you could give them today?
Yeah, I do. I start with a practice. This is scary, maybe. It's just in the morning when you look in the mirror, really try to look in your eyes and go, do you see me? Do you see? Because that's what I do every morning. Because I look in the mirror and I don't see me. I see it's lifeless. It just feels dead. And I'm like, look in my eyes, going, where are you? Do you see me? I know you're in there. And it is hard. And it's, now that life hasn't flowed, whatever, because I'm dealing with a lot of the challenges I didn't have to deal with before, you have to know. I think anything is possible, but you must not feel alone. Once you feel alone or you feel separate than others, that's when it's really, really a challenge. And that's kind of what I want to say to people is if you feel alone, like, I'm here, like, call me. I don't care. Just because the world has always been my family. And because of the way my brain developed, there's a reason, it's the optic nerve thing, why it's an optic nerve, the way it perceives light, that allows me to have a hard time separating, feeling separate from the world. It's really cool when I found it out. But it's because of strangers that I did everything. I maintained adventure and courage and fearlessness my whole life. That never, that wouldn't have happened if it weren't for strangers. So I owe strangers the world, you know what I mean? Because they were there for me when I needed them. So I will be for there when they need me,
Oh, that's so beautiful. Thank you so much for being a guest on our show today. You truly are an angel. So it's been wonderful having you here.
Thank you.
Go ahead.
Karen. Yeah, no, I was just going to say, and then one time I usually ask more questions. I kind of got on a roll talking. When I get like that, I think I let it go now because I know it's kind of channeling through me. It's like, yeah. So I don't interrupt it anymore, but I would love to hear more about your story, offline or whatever. Yeah.
No, I think since you asked online, I've got to answer that because people be like, wait, what? So I'm pretty public with my story now, but I wasn't until just a few years ago. It took me waking up one day and saying, how can I expect people to keep being vulnerable with me if I am not allowing myself to be vulnerable? So I am also a survivor of significant childhood abuse, neglect, emotional abuse was the worst, physical abuse, and some sexual abuse. And then I've worked in toxic work environments and had an emotionally abusive marriage. So lots of trauma in my history. And like yourself, I have always been a compassionate, genuine person that really wanted to heal and make a difference in this world. And that's why I started my company and why I have a global virtual group membership for survivors who want to stop being a victim and really want to work on thriving with the gifts that they have is sort of the mission of our company. So I hope I answered that succinctly. Yeah. I know we could talk for days and days and days.
I know you did. And you know what? I just realized when I'm on Zoom, it's really hard. I'm used to looking in someone's eyes. It's that I always forget to look at the light. So I'm thinking, oh, this is good. It's going to look like I'm staring at I'm looking at Karen's eyes the whole time. Totally forgot about the green light up there. I'm looking. So I apologize. I'm not going to be looking at the audience, but I was honed in on Karen's eyes. Sorry. I just realized I didn't do that.
It's really hard. Yeah. My camera is different where your face is on the monitor. So it's really hard. It probably looks like I've been looking at your eyes, but
you've been pretty good.
Yeah.
I'm trying to train myself. Yeah. It's funny. That was one of the things of trauma when I would interview women. And if it was on, not on Zoom, but if I saw when they were thinking if their eyes went up to the right or the left, I'm like, trauma. And son of a gun, it worked pretty well. It's like the tracking And the optic nerve sometimes gets involved in tracking of the eyes, which is one of the things my eyes don't track the same. So it's called visual incongruence. You probably, if you worked with kids, it's something that kids have. Well, in 64, they didn't know anything about it. So, you know, real world, not a big deal. Computers, a little bit of a challenge. So, but anyhow. All right, Karen, thank you so very much.
Yeah. Goodbye for the second time, right?
Goodbye for the second time. All right. See you later. Bye, everyone.
Thank you for listening in today. Please join us next week, same day and time. Also, I would love for you to check out my website, healthrivedream.com.